October 1944, the heart of the final year of the war in Europe, U.S. military authorities began transporting increasing numbers of German prisoners of war across the Atlantic. Many of these men had endured months on the Eastern Front, suffered Allied aerial bombardment of their cities, and experienced tightening supply shortages at home. When they arrived aboard Liberty ships into American ports, the contrast between expectation and reality struck them immediately. At first, the German captives expected harsh treatment. Rumors abounded among German units that American camps would replicate the feared Soviet model. Crowded barracks, insufficient rations, constant oversight. Instead, they found bright Pullman railway cars, food placed before them en route, and orderly uniforms awaiting them in processing centers. One historian noted that German POWs arriving in the United States were surprised to discover the comfort of the Pullman cars, the country's large size and undamaged prosperity. The official U.S. policymakers had chosen rural, lightly populated camps to minimize risk and logistical difficulty, but that decision also meant the prisoners arrived in landscapes where the war had not reached ruin. The barracks were new or well-maintained, the grounds level, the utilities functioning. When the men reached camps such as those in Alabama, Kansas, Michigan, or Louisiana, they found canteens where they could spend scrip earned by labor. They found books, radios, concerts, sometimes interface with civilians. The things they had missed, like reliable heat, full meals, recreation, were now present. One former POW said simply, "The food was excellent and plentiful. After everything we went through, it is just like a rest cure to be here." The irony was not lost on those who still considered themselves soldiers rather than guests. The phrase, "just like a rest cure," captured the blunt acknowledgement that for many Germans, captivity in the United States offered more comfort than frontline service or civilian hardship. At the same time, U.S. military authorities were under obligation. The Geneva Convention required the POWs to receive rations comparable to U.S. troops at base camps and to be treated humanely. American officials recognized that poorly treated prisoners might provoke retaliatory measures for U.S. servicemen held by Germany or its allies. Following this legal and pragmatic guideline, inadvertently produced a system where German prisoners, many of them non-ideological infantry or soldiers stranded far from home, found themselves in conditions far better than they had ever known. For many, the war did not end at capture, but their suffering did. Inside the camps, the men were registered, issued uniforms, given bedrolls or cots, and introduced to camp routines. Work assignments followed, usually in agriculture, logging, or factory support paid at small daily rates. But even that work carried privileges. Those who earned scrip could buy sweets, soft drinks, personal items. The routine of discipline, labor, and leisure was designed to keep men busy, productive, and under supervision, but it also created a quiet stability. At a time when families in Germany scraped for bread, the prisoners in the United States found themselves with 3 meals, a bunk, heat, and order. Even early letters from POWs betray the mix of resignation and disbelief. They wrote home about electric lights and individual cots with quilts, about showers any hour, and about the surprise at regular shipments of coffee and sugar. These small details mattered deeply in a wartime economy where these goods were rationed heavily. And although the men remained conscious that their captors were still their enemies, many admitted to feeling a broad relief, not in the sense of joy at defeat, but relief from unending stress. One former POW later described his captivity as lifting, an experience that shaped his life. As October turned into November, the camps continued to fill. The U.S. Army's logistics pulled in large groups of German soldiers and officers, many bypassing European repatriation zones. The provision system held steady. Reporting from camp inspections suggested medical and food standards matched those of U.S. base camps, with low mortality rates. While the men awaited further disposition, they began to settle into the rhythms of camp life: roll call, work units, recreation hours, canteen visits. For many of the German soldiers, the expectation of incarceration was grim, but the reality was not. It felt strange to be a prisoner and yet feel safer than at war. By November 1944, word had spread among captured German units about the strange reputation of American prisoner of war camps. Soldiers arriving from the European front whispered in disbelief, "The Americans feed you like kings." The surprise was immediate and sensory. Upon arrival, each man received full rations identical to those issued to U.S. Army personnel stationed stateside. The Geneva Convention had required parity in food quality and caloric value between captors and captives. But in practice, the Americans went beyond mere compliance. The average daily ration for a prisoner amounted to roughly 3,000 calories, a staggering amount compared to what many Wehrmacht soldiers or German civilians were receiving. At that point in the war, breakfasts often included eggs, bacon, toast with butter, and coffee. Lunch and dinner alternated between stews, meats, vegetables, and even occasional desserts. The abundance was partly logistical. American agriculture had not been disrupted by bombing or occupation, but it also reflected an institutional mindset. The War Department believed well-fed prisoners were less likely to rebel, more productive in labor detachments, and easier to manage administratively. To men accustomed to thin beet soup or hard biscuits on the Eastern Front, the contrast was astonishing. Several memoirs and interviews recorded after the war echo the same reaction. "We could not believe it," one prisoner from Camp Ruston later recalled. "We ate the same food as the guards, sometimes even better." Another noted that the canteen sold items that most Germans had not seen in years: chocolate, cigarettes, and white bread. That last item, white bread, became symbolic. In wartime Germany, bread was rationed and dark with fillers. In the United States it was fluffy, soft, and plentiful. German prisoners began jokingly calling it the taste of America. It came to represent the strange paradox of their situation. Defeated soldiers consuming the luxuries their victors took for. Granted, the POWs were not the only ones to notice. Inspectors from the International Committee of the Red Cross, who regularly toured the camps, recorded consistently high marks for food quality and quantity. In many cases, inspectors observed that U.S. enlisted soldiers assigned to guard duty were eating the same meals as the prisoners. And on occasion, the prisoners' meals were prepared better because they were cooked by trained German chefs among them. Camp Ruston in Louisiana became a well-documented example. Among its 10,000 prisoners were professional cooks, bakers, and even pastry chefs, formerly attached to German hotels or naval units. They were quickly placed in the camp kitchens, transforming army rations into elaborate meals. Stews were seasoned properly, bread baked fresh, and cakes occasionally appeared at holidays. Guards joked that the prisoners were spoiling us too. But this abundance produced a quiet unease among some American observers. Newspaper reporters who visited the camps occasionally remarked that the treatment seemed too generous. Letters from U.S. soldiers overseas voiced frustration that enemy prisoners were living more comfortably than they were in the field. However, officials defended the policy. Maintaining good conditions for POWs was both a matter of honor and of practicality. Any mistreatment could have endangered tens of thousands of Americans held in German captivity. Still, the reaction from the prisoners themselves remained disbelief, bordering on amusement. Some referred to their stay as a kulinarischer Urlaub, a culinary vacation. They kept careful notebooks of American recipes to bring home. They marveled at the variety of fruits and vegetables, at the strange abundance of sugar, and at the endless coffee, luxuries that had vanished from their homeland. The dining halls became places of quiet observation. Through the food, many Germans began to perceive the scale of American industrial power. The portions were not merely generous. They represented an economy untouched by scarcity. Each loaf of bread or cut of meat served to a prisoner was a reminder of the logistical strength that had already decided the war's outcome. Yet, behind that recognition was something deeper, a softening of perception. Some prisoners began to see their captors as humans rather than faceless enemies. One Luftwaffe mechanic later said, "We expected humiliation, but we were treated with respect. It confused us." Food in this sense became more than sustenance. It was diplomacy by daily repetition. By late winter 1945, the label vacation camp began to circulate informally among the prisoners. They used it half jokingly, half seriously. For many, captivity had brought the first full meals, safe sleep, and regular medical care they had experienced since the war began. As they worked in the fields or workshops under light guard, they began to compare notes and realized the strange truth. Life in an American prison camp was, by all practical measures, easier than life in wartime Germany. By the spring of 1945, daily life inside many American prisoner-of-war camps had settled into a structured rhythm that felt almost civilian. The camps, spread across more than 40 states, were built according to standard War Department blueprints: long rows of wooden barracks, mess halls, workshops, and recreation yards, all enclosed by tall fences and guard towers. But beyond the barbed wire, the routine resembled a small self-contained town rather than a prison. Each morning the bugle call sounded at 6 o'clock, followed by roll call in the open yard. The prisoners stood in neat ranks, often joking quietly among themselves while American guards, usually young National Guardsmen or older reservists, checked attendance. Afterward came breakfast, hot coffee, oatmeal, or scrambled eggs, depending on supplies, served in orderly fashion through the camp kitchens. The food lines were calm. The men knew there would always be enough. That alone set these camps apart from nearly every other wartime experience they had known. Many POWs, including veterans from the Eastern Front, later described that consistency as the first real security we felt in years. After breakfast, the camp divided into work details. Some prisoners labored on nearby farms, logging operations or military depots under Army supervision. Others worked as mechanics, carpenters, or cooks inside the camp itself. They were paid in canteen coupons, a small wage that could be exchanged for cigarettes, soap, stationery, or candy. The workday lasted about 8 hours, followed by recreation time in the late afternoon. This was when the transformation of captivity became visible. Soccer fields appeared inside camp fences. Makeshift theaters were built from spare lumber. Bands formed using instruments provided by the YMCA and the Red Cross. At Camp Ruston, one of the largest facilities, the German prisoners even organized a full orchestra and a dramatic troupe. They performed classical concerts and plays before both prisoners and guards. A local radio station once broadcast one of these performances live, a small but telling symbol of how normalized the camp environment had become. The guards generally encouraged such activity. As long as the rules were followed and discipline maintained, the U.S. Army allowed the prisoners considerable freedom of organization. The logic was simple. Occupied minds were peaceful minds. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere was surprisingly domestic. Each hut housed around 40 men, with wooden bunks, heating stoves, and electric lights. Prisoners were responsible for cleanliness, inspections were routine, and order was maintained largely by German non-commissioned officers under American oversight. Letters were permitted, censored, but regular. Packages from the International Red Cross occasionally supplemented the rations: chocolate, tobacco, or even books. The camp libraries contained thousands of volumes, many donated by local citizens. Classes were offered on subjects ranging from mathematics to English, and a number of POWs earned certificates equivalent to American high school diplomas before repatriation. What struck the Germans most was the sense of fairness. Punishments for infractions were mild compared to what they expected. Solitary confinement was rare, corporal punishment forbidden. The guards followed clear procedures, and in most camps treated the men with restraint. One prisoner later remarked, "It was discipline without hate." The difference between this environment and the brutal conditions of Nazi-run camps was not lost on them. Some prisoners began to question what they had been taught about the enemy. They wrote home cautiously about the strange civility of the Americans. Others expressed guilt, realizing how their own regime had treated Allied captives. The overall morale was high. Boredom rather than fear was the enemy. To fight it, the prisoners filled their days with purpose, crafting furniture from scrap wood, painting landscapes, or forming sports teams. Inter-camp tournaments even took place, with local townspeople invited to watch. This atmosphere of calm and structure led many to call the camps Ferienlager, holiday camps. It was an ironic term, but not entirely inaccurate. Compared to the chaos of Europe in its final months, life behind American wire offered stability, food, and safety. The Red Cross noted that German POW mortality in the United States remained below 1%, an astonishing figure given the scale of the population, which exceeded 400,000. Evenings were quiet. The men wrote letters, played chess, or listened to shortwave broadcasts. A few camps allowed small Christmas trees during the holidays, and some chaplains organized joint services for prisoners and guards. By the war's end, the pattern had become so routine that many Germans dreaded release. Rumors circulated that returning home meant hunger, destruction, and Soviet captivity. For them, the barbed wire had come to represent a strange kind of safety. Not freedom, but peace. Inside Camp Ruston's sprawling dining hall, the first mealtime for newly arrived German prisoners often came as a revelation. Stainless steel trays clattered across long wooden tables as the line moved briskly. The men, still in their standard issue, prisoner uniforms with the stenciled PW letters across their backs, expected watery soup or crusts of bread. Instead, the air was rich with the scent of roasted beef, coffee, and freshly baked bread. To their astonishment, guards handed them full portions, sliced meat, mashed potatoes, green beans, and pie. Many stood frozen, unsure if it was some form of mockery. One prisoner later recalled in an interview decades later, "We thought it was a mistake. We had never eaten like this, not even in the Wehrmacht." The menu followed the same nutritional standards used for American troops in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Rations included meat, vegetables, milk, butter, jam, and even desserts. Coffee was served daily. Cigarettes were available at the camp canteen, and some prisoners, with a touch of irony, would use their cigarette rations to trade for items from the guards. Reports from the War Department and camp inspection logs show that POWs often consumed around 3,000 calories a day, sometimes more than what American soldiers in active combat received. While US GIs in the field lived on C rations or K rations, POWs sat down to cooked meals prepared in clean kitchens, staffed by their own men under U.S. supervision. In Louisiana's humid evenings, the smell of bread and stew would drift across the barbed wire. Guards noted that mealtimes were peaceful, even cheerful. The Germans, who had expected starvation or punishment, were instead gaining weight. One American sergeant joked that some prisoners looked better fed than he was. Over time, meals became moments of quiet dignity for the POWs. They ate together, talked softly about home, and occasionally hummed folk tunes. In the corner of the dining hall, a large Red Cross poster reminded everyone, guards and prisoners alike, of the standards they were bound to uphold. But the abundance did not only satisfy hunger, it carried a psychological effect. For many Germans, raised on Nazi propaganda portraying Americans as decadent and cruel, the reality of fair treatment was deeply unsettling. They began to question the image their leaders had painted of the enemy. One prisoner, once a schoolteacher in Bremen, wrote in his journal, "They feed us like guests. It is strange to be cared for by those we were told were barbarians." That sentence, like many others preserved in oral histories, reveals the subtle moral reversal unfolding inside the wire. The camp mess hall became more than a place to eat. It became a quiet classroom where enemy soldiers learned a different lesson about democracy, discipline, and decency. By the winter of 1944, daily life in Camp Ruston had settled into a rhythm that many German prisoners privately compared to a holiday under guard. Work details began early in the morning, after breakfast, when the Louisiana mist still clung to the pine trees beyond the barbed wire. The men marched in neat columns to their assignments, some to maintain the camp's grounds, others to assist local farmers, repair roads, or stack lumber. Under Geneva Convention rules, officers could refuse labor, but enlisted men were encouraged to work. Most accepted gladly. The tasks were light, the pay modest, and the conditions humane. Prisoners earned token wages in canteen coupons, which could be exchanged for cigarettes, candy, or even stationery to write letters home. For men who had spent years on the Eastern Front or in the ruins of France, this new routine felt unreal. They worked without fear of beatings or executions. American guards treated them with formal, detached professionalism, firm but rarely cruel. The contrast to the chaos they had left behind was striking. During the afternoons, when work was done, the camp came alive with small moments of normal life. Some prisoners formed soccer teams, while others joined theater troupes or brass bands. The camp library grew steadily, stocked with donated books and materials from the YMCA and the International Red Cross. A few enterprising prisoners even started informal classes in mathematics, English, and mechanical drawing. Inspection reports from 1944 describe Camp Ruston as orderly, self-sufficient, and largely content. A Swiss Red Cross delegate who visited wrote that morale appears high and relations between guards and prisoners are correct and good-humored. In the evenings, the men gathered in the recreation yard, the air filled with the soft strumming of a guitar or the distant hum of conversation. The mood was often relaxed, far from the bitterness expected of captured soldiers. For many, captivity had brought an unexpected peace. That sense of comfort unsettled some of the American guards. A few veterans who had seen combat in Europe resented the idea that the enemy might live better than their own brothers in the field. "They eat steak and listen to music while our boys sleep in mud," one corporal grumbled. Yet the rules were clear. Prisoners were to be treated according to international law. Letters from prisoners' families, delivered through the Red Cross, added another layer of irony. Many Germans wrote home describing their life as tolerable, even comfortable. One wrote, "It feels like a long rest. We play soccer, eat well, and sleep without fear." For their relatives in bombed-out cities, such words were hard to believe. Despite the fences and guards, the camp's atmosphere reflected something deeper than leniency. It was a deliberate psychological stance. By maintaining fairness and structure, American officials hoped to demonstrate the superiority of democratic order over Nazi brutality. Each fair meal, each humane gesture, was a quiet act of propaganda. Still, not every prisoner was content. Some longed for combat or felt shame in living well while others died. But even they could not deny the peculiar truth of captivity in America. For many, it truly did feel like a vacation from war. By early spring of 1945, Camp Ruston had evolved into a small self-contained society. Within its fences, life began to imitate the rhythms of peace. The prisoners, drawn from every corner of the German military, built a structure of their own, disciplined, orderly, and astonishingly creative. The camp's theater troupe became a centerpiece of morale. In a converted barracks hall, prisoners painted backdrops, stitched costumes from old uniforms, and built wooden stage props out of scrap lumber. On weekends, the curtain would rise before an audience of hundreds. They performed plays by Schiller and Goethe, but also comedies and musical acts written by the men themselves. American guards sometimes attended, curious and amused, applauding alongside their captives. Music carried through the camp almost daily. An orchestra of 20 musicians practiced under the direction of a former Berlin conductor. Violins, clarinets, and a dented trombone had been scavenged through donations from local civilians and the Red Cross. Radio station KWKH from Shreveport even broadcast a concert performed by the prisoners, a surreal moment when German captives played for American listeners across the airwaves. Beyond entertainment, intellectual pursuits flourished. A camp university, unofficial but meticulously organized, offered classes in subjects ranging from mathematics and economics to English language and American history. Some prisoners studied mechanical design, learning from American manuals, preparing for the day they would rebuild their lives in a shattered Germany. In the canteen, prisoners could purchase notebooks, pencils, or chocolate bars using the coupons they earned from work details. Letters from home arrived through the International Red Cross every few weeks, though always heavily censored. For many, those fragile pages of handwriting were their only link to the world beyond the wire. Religious services were permitted and often well attended. A makeshift chapel stood near the southern fence, its walls lined with simple wooden benches and a hand-carved cross. Catholic priests and Protestant ministers among the prisoners shared duties, holding joint services for Christmas and Easter that drew nearly the entire camp. Daily routines reflected remarkable discipline. Lights out came at 9 o'clock, and inspections were brief and uneventful. Conflicts were rare, and when they did occur, they were usually between prisoners. Ideological disputes between old Wehrmacht regulars and die-hard Nazi loyalists. American guards mostly watched from a distance, intervening only when order broke down. Observers from the Red Cross described the atmosphere as productive, calm, and well administered. They noted that morale among prisoners was higher than expected, attributing it to good food, freedom of organization, and meaningful work. For many Germans, captivity had become an opportunity for reflection, and for some, quiet disillusionment with the regime that had led them into war. When word reached them that Allied troops had crossed the Rhine, the camp's tone shifted subtly. Some prisoners cheered, others grew silent, but the daily life of Camp Ruston continued unchanged. Meals served on time, soccer matches played on weekends, and theater performances still drawing applause. It was a strange paradox. Men who had fought in one of the most brutal wars in history, now living in a place that, by comparison, felt civilized and almost gentle. They were still prisoners, yet in many ways freer than they had been under the iron discipline of the Reich. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, word of victory rippled through Camp Ruston slowly, muffled by the usual censorship and routine. There was no triumphant cheer among the prisoners, only a long collective silence. Many stood in the yard that afternoon, staring past the fences toward the pine-covered hills, wondering what would be left of the world they once knew. Repatriation did not come immediately. The United States government faced the enormous logistical task of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners across the Atlantic. Many men at Camp Ruston remained through late 1945, some even into the early months of 1946. During that time, daily life continued much as before, though an undercurrent of uncertainty grew stronger. The prisoners heard reports, cities flattened, families displaced, food scarce. Letters from home became more desperate, written on thin scraps of paper, often signed with trembling hands. For some, the realization struck deeply. Their lives inside the American camp had been more secure and humane than what awaited them in their liberated homeland. When departure finally came, it was quiet and orderly. The men packed their few possessions: handmade chess sets, theater programs, photographs taken with American guards. Trucks rolled out of Camp Ruston toward the rail line at Shreveport, carrying men who had once been enemies, but now felt oddly reluctant to leave. Those who returned to Germany often spoke of the camp with disbelief. In interviews conducted decades later, former prisoners described it not as punishment, but as a strange kind of refuge. One recalled, "We did not understand it at first. How could our captors feed us so well while their own men fought overseas? It was like living in another world." Another said simply, "It was not paradise, but compared to home it felt like a vacation." Historians later viewed this contrast as symbolic. The humane treatment of German prisoners, rooted in the Geneva Convention and reinforced by American pragmatism, reflected a philosophy that war could be fought without surrendering humanity. It stood in stark opposition to the brutality that defined so many other fronts of the conflict. When Camp Ruston finally closed in 1946, its barracks fell silent. The fences rusted, the guard towers were dismantled, and the Louisiana woods reclaimed the land. Yet for the men who had lived there, the memory endured. A camp where they ate better than soldiers at the front, played music for their captors, and learned, perhaps for the first time, what dignity in defeat could feel like. For many, it was a lesson that outlived the war itself, that compassion, even between enemies, could change the course of memory more deeply than any victory ever could.